Yes, good morning. Yeah, Kemboy, can you hear me?
Yes, John, I confirm I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, my name is John Mutua. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs as a programs coordinator, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar. Um, this is part of the webinars that we've been, a series of webinars that we've been holding on the Industry 254 conversation. So this is the fourth webinar this year, and actually the final one for the year. So just to mention, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank that promotes debate and dialogue on public policy issues. We have six policy areas, and in today's webinar, um, like in the past three webinars, there are two programs that will be hosting us. So we have Kwame Owino, who is our chief executive. He also heads the program on popular economics. And Leo Kembo is a program officer and works in the program on constitution law and economy. So the two programs are the ones that will be hosting us again. So as you can see from the screen, yeah, the title of today's webinar is a review of Kenya's national industrialization policy 2012 to 2030. So we'll be looking at issues of, whether it's the hits and the misses, basically. Just to recap or just refresh our memories, the three previous webinars are actually, the first one actually looked at issues of concentration or geography of industries in Kenya. And of course, most of the industries are concentrated in the more urban. There's about 7 urban-based counties, or the ones that are closest to Nairobi and at the coast. Then the second one was on the industrialization, and the third on economic complexity. So those are the three discussions that we've held under the industry, as part of this series on Industry 254 conversation. So without further ado, I will welcome our participants, but just to mention quick uh, housekeeping, basically. We'll have the two presenters. I'm not sure whether we are starting with Kwame. We'll have Leo, I think, go first, then Kwame, and then after they are done with the presentation, that will take not about 30 minutes or so, then we will invite, I will invite the participants to share their comments and pose their questions to the speakers. But as this goes on, if you have anything that you'd like to mention, please also feel free to use the chat box or the Q&A platform. Okay, so yes, so Kemboy, please go ahead.
Kwame will go first, yes.
Okay, Kwame is going first. Okay, thank you. So Kwame, please go ahead. Yeah, so just give us a few, maybe just 2 minutes. I think in the meantime, Kemboy, maybe you can share the second slide with the outline, just for our participants to interact with it as we wait for Kwame to kick us off.
All right. Hi, John. Sorry, I'm using Leo's machine because I'm
okay.
unable to
Sorry.
activate. Yeah, so maybe I should go ahead, right?
Please do.
Okay, fine. So basically, good afternoon, everybody. I mean, the IEA has been, this year the IEA has been running a series of conversations on industrial policy in Kenya and the state of manufacturing. And so we've run a couple of them, but basically our outline today is what is the policy, what's the content of the policy, what are its expected outcomes, what was the performance, and then we'll talk about what does this mean for the reviews that are taking place around this policy. So the background is basically Kenya's industrial policy is actually based on sessional paper number 9 of 2012. And this sessional paper itself was extracted from the goals stated in Kenya's Vision 2030. So basically, this is an implementing strategy based on what the requirements and the details of the Vision 2030 is. So it's a continuation of the Vision 2030. And it's called the National Industrialization Policy, issued by and managed by the Ministry of Industrialization in Kenya. So that's a background, and I think that background is essential for knowing how the policy came to be and some of the goals that we'll see under it. Now, the main objective of this policy, as we stated, is basically to achieve a growth rate, an annual growth rate from 2012 of 15% per annum for the Kenya's manufacturing sector. And to maintain that for up to and until the conclusion of the Vision 2030. Now, remember, this means it is from this policy that it was expected that at that time, manufacturing was just slightly above, about 12% or 13% of GDP. If it grew at 15% per annum, total output would be high. In addition to that, manufacturing's share of national of GDP, of national value added, would also grow because that growth rate would be 5 percentage points above the 10 percentage points that would be required of Vision 2030. So let me take that again. Vision 2030 anticipated that Kenya would achieve and maintain a growth rate of 10% from the time it reached its peak and all the way up to 2030. And by that, would convert the country into a newly industrialized economy, a proper middle income country, rather. So that's first. Now, that growth rate of 10% would be for the entire economy. However, given that manufacturing was expected to achieve or to contribute significantly to Kenya's growth and employment, manufacturing in turn will be growing at 15%, while the national economy or GDP would be growing at 10%. So you can see that manufacturing was expected to actually grow and actually constitute a larger share of national value added. And that's why there was an expectation that manufacturing would reach somewhere between 20 and 25% of GDP, consistent with most other countries that have achieved that level of growth and sustained it for a generation. So what are the specific targets? So the general target is to make sure manufacturing grows at 15% per annum, dominating overall growth rate, which would be 10%. And that means over time, manufacturing will constitute a larger share of GDP than it did at that time, which started at about 12 or 13%. So meaning that it would double over time as a share of the national economy. Now, first would be to increase manufacturing. That's interesting in manufacturing value added and output totally. The second target would be to develop niche products, basically to ensure that Kenya was not only producing and exporting, both for national and, producing not both for national consumption and for exports, primary products, but products with a greater manufacturing component, but also a greater value add component. And that's why the 15% target was important. That would not happen with Kenya continuing to produce low value added and primary products. At the same time, to achieve the kind of investment that would be required to make sure that growth target is achieved, would be obviously to attract substantial foreign direct investment. In addition to that would be to establish the special economic zones and SME parks. Again, picking from the example of Southeast and other Asian countries. And other Asian countries that have achieved this, basically special economic zones, specifically as have been successfully done in some parts of China, and the SME parks, noting that most of Kenya's manufacturing in both the formal and especially the informal sector come from SMEs. So establishing SME parks to allow for creation of clusters, but also for crowding in the infrastructure that is required for manufacturing to thrive would be essential. And then the final one was obviously balancing the financing domestically by the creation of an industrial development fund in Kenya. So those are the targets, and therefore to assess what Kenya's industrial and manufacturing policy has achieved would require us to check against this list one after the other. So again, the policy required a certain institutional assessment, as you can tell, starting up there with the cabinet, establishing a commission, which would fit very well with the Better and UDA government, which establishes almost a commission for everything else. There'll be an expectation that then a commission for driving manufacturing would be set up. So this is the institutional structure. Now, don't concentrate so much on it, but basically you need to understand that, yes, there's an expectation that manufacturing would have a very high policy profile and placed in places where there's direct influence, or rather there's direct interaction between the implementing actors on the one side and the cabinet and the decision policy-making bodies. This policy, we've spoken about what the policy's main goals were, but I'll come to talking about the policy itself is therefore constructed, remember, into 10 specific pillars. We like to arrange things in pillars in Kenya. So one of the first pillars would be creating an enabling business environment. The assessment was that part of the reason manufacturing had not thrived or had not grown at a rate much faster than it had up to 2012 was that the business environment in general was not conducive to manufacturing and greater value addition. So part of that was to create an enabling environment, maintain macroeconomic stability, strengthen commercial justice, and of course, build predictable regulatory and institutional foundations. The second was a pillar of value addition. So in addition to value addition being a consequence of the goals, here value addition as a direct priority is placed, basically, and government then picks specific sectors, which tends to be very dicey, but basically specific sectors for raising competitiveness. As you can tell, 22 sectors, large, provided into 3 clusters. So one would be less labor-intensive sectors, driven by the fact that Kenya had a mass of people and population with adequate education to be fed into manufacturing sector. So this would be manufacturing that is based or built from labor-intensive sectors. So those are agro processing, which is tea, coffee, fruits, oils, fish and nuts, textiles and apparel, leather and leather goods. And then there'd be medium technology sectors as well, which is iron and steel, machine tools, agro machinery, pharmaceuticals. And the third part would be advanced manufacturing. So you can tell that the pillar had value addition, but understands that labor-intensive sectors would be essential and an easy feed. But there's also possibility for medium technologies sectors, iron and steel, and then advanced manufacturing, which is biotechnology and nanotechnology possibilities. The third sector, the fourth pillar, obviously, would be human capital and skills development. Clear that obviously, if you're in a manufacturing sector, manufacturing is not just about fitting tools here and there, but you also need human capital to complement what the FDI would be bringing and what the investments would be. And also that the human capital component is essential for raising the value addition quotient of the manufactured goods and services. So you can see here there's been TVETs, the Kenya Industrial Research and Development Institute, expanding engineering and technical training schools. I think that speaks for itself. Pillar 5 will be FDI attraction and industrial clustering, trying to create clusters. And here, the critical things would be to establish SEZs, special economic zones, offer incentives for anchor tenants. Basically, anchor tenants would be one big farm, for instance, if it invited a multinational manufacturing firm into the country and established them in a specific geographical area, it is possible to create clusters through feedback loops by those who provide services to it, those who provide other goods that are essential or intermediate goods for its manufacturing, while at the same time providing the knowledge that fits for the creation of clusters and promote diaspora investments. Pillar 8 would be to ensure market access, expand regional export presence from 7% at that time to 15%, addressing non-traditional, non-tariff barriers, creating standards, and obviously logistics bottlenecks, which remain Kenya's big problem. Strengthening brand Kenya for manufacturing exports. Here you can see suggestions of course, buying Kenya and building Kenya to strengthen Kenya as a brand for manufactured goods. Pillar 7 would be about standards, quality, and intellectual property regime, a component especially of middle scale, or rather medium level and high value addition, such as nanotechnology and the others. A component of that requires intellectual property because one, manufacturing firms have patents or they have industrial designs, which they would have to bring in as essential for quality signaling, and those would require that intellectual property to be protected. And so Kenya understands, or the industrial policy, industrial plan required that standards and quality be maintained together with a strong protection of intellectual property rights. Pillar 8 would be industrial research and development, innovation and technology transfer. Here, of course, is to support the Kenya Industrial Research and Development Institute and university to create linkages in knowledge transfer and creation, asking the right questions and designing stuff. Why? Because while manufacturing involves definitely putting goods, putting services, teaching things, putting apparel and all that together, the main part on the whole is basically it's built on knowledge. And especially if a country wishes to go up the ladder from low scale, or rather high energy, high mass and labor intensive towards the more capital intensive and knowledge intensive manufacturing, which creates higher value addition. Promoting cleaner production and modern technologies, because of course the pressure for and the possibility of using cleaner production as a premium would be useful, premium products, and encourage reverse engineering and local tool making. So reverse engineering obviously comes from research and design, and obviously the place of educational institutions and research institutions becomes essential here. Pillar 8 would be encouraging MSME growth and graduation. So definitely the reality of Kenya at that time and even today was that there was a significant problem with the middle. So you had large manufacturing firms and you had very, very many small manufacturing firms, but there's a missing middle. And part of what government was planning to do is to ensure the growth of medium and small and micro enterprises who constituted 95% of manufacturing units, but they had lower productivity. And therefore to elevate them through MSME growth and graduation would be definitely part of this strategy. And it makes sense. It's self-evident. Promoting subcontracting, incubation, clustering by connecting them to the other clusters created under Pillar 8 and 5. And Pillar 10 would be basically a question of finance. Finance is identified as a significant barrier for investments and manufacturing investments, especially for the micro and small enterprise, medium and small enterprises. Sometimes financing is a barrier. People have ideas, they wish to scale their production and marketing, and then they face the barrier of government, or rather of inadequate capital, or capital that is available designed to enable a manufacturing firm or a small manufacturer to scale their products and actually create new value. And so government purposed to create a 10 billion shillings industrial development fund and to provide long-term financing, which was missing in the commercial bank system, and to strengthen development finance institutions through 10 billion. Now, we can ask ourselves whether 10 billion was adequate, but I think in our reading, this was supposed to be seed money with the expectation that if you capitalize the fund, it would be possible over time to grow it through lending the money. So we can see here that what were the expected incomes? out of the 10 pillars and the goals that we created, which was to make sure manufacturing was working, or rather growing at 15% while the economy is growing at 10%. That's a really, really fast and unprecedented rates of growth for many countries. But if that was fully implemented, the policy anticipated 6 things. One, manufacturing sector would grow at 15% annually. And if you compound 15% annually for 18 years, that would be significant. It would make Kenya certainly a rising regional and industrial hub. So that's the second one. Obtaining from the fact that maintaining 15% annually and compounding it would be significant. The second, of course, would be domestic value addition of more than 20% improving annually, creating not just markets for domestic products, but at the same time, higher levels and quality production. Increasing regional market share to 15%. And of course, in the quantification, at least 2 special economic zones and 5 small and medium enterprises parks would be operational over the lifetime of this plan. And manufacturing would become a major employer, especially because of the recognition that Kenya would be undergoing a youth bulge, demographic change, which means the demand for employment by Kenya's youth would be high. If manufacturing sector grew at the rates that were anticipated, it would be a major provider of employment in Kenya. And then the final one, obviously, is if you consolidate, or rather the confluence of all these 5 factors would lead to Kenya would definitely, with those growth rates, that level of investment, improvements in quality, the number of successful special economic zones added to the SME parks would definitely create result in Kenya being a regional industrial hub within East Africa. So those are the expected outcomes. Let's now ask ourselves, in order to tell whether this policy has been successful, Kenya Industrialization Policy under Sessional Paper number 9 of 2012, it will be assessed against the benchmarks. What were the expected goals, or what were the targets? And now my colleague Leo will assess each of those targets in turn and give us a result. Thank you.
Kembo, you're muted.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So as Kwame has explained, what the policy entails, what were the broad goals, what were the broad objectives, and subsequently what the policy entailed. And the expectation was that having done all that, specific outcomes would have been achieved. So we want to assess those specific issues, and also tick against what was done. So one of them was that manufacturing as a share of GDP would be now closer to 15% or 15% or closer to 15% by end of 2030. But as you see from the data, there's a very sharp divergence. Actually, there is what we call premature deindustrialization. That manufacturing sector is growing on a nominal basis, but not growing faster than the other sectors. So the other sectors of the economy, primarily services, are growing faster than manufacturing. And that has implication for, because this was one major goal of the industrialization policy, that would have been met. And there's a big story to be told about this, because it means, one, either specific outcomes that were supposed to have been specific steps that policy steps that were to be taken were not taken, or they did not achieve those specific results. Second question is, as Kwame showed in that chart, there was supposed to be a commission, and that commission was to have the links with private sector, the National Industrialization Development Commission. Private sector, it was supposed to universities, link, build capability. It's supposed to speak to banks, to financial sector, all the other elements of private sector. So this commission was created on paper, but in terms of, and that would have required simultaneous investments in infrastructure, standards, technology, finance. But that was, in the end, the NIDC was created on paper. Another thing to check is the question of industrial policy, the question of industrial development fund. At that time, there was a proposal for a capitalization of Kenya shillings 10 billion for the industrial development fund. And that was never that idea in the end was not put in place. And secondly, it was additionally, it was also a small, it's also a small ambition, because if government identified that there was commercial banks would not provide intermediation for manufacturing sector, and therefore they needed a government-owned industrial development fund. So you'd expect that if, say for today, manufacturing sector is borrowing something close to 600 billion shillings, that capitalization would at least lead to 1/3 of what is of what is available. And then another thing was special economic zones and SME parks. This, I think, has largely been met. But here, the special economic zones, so they were, the Special Economic Zones Act was passed into place. The authority, the specific license have already been issued. For the SME parks, there are those that were constructed prior by the previous administrations. But even the current administration is doing what we call the CIPes, which is county industrial, the industrial parks. But that does not solve the core problem of manufacturing, as we'll explain in subsequently what else. Another question about value addition, and this is from a chart from a previous webinar, is that part of it was expectation that as Kenya ages towards 2030, majority of Kenya's manufacturing will be in medium complexity and high complexity. And to be able to show, they listed, for example, high complexity, so biotech, nanotechnology. But as you see, the picture as it is today presents a different view. Manufacturing is still low complexity, in the low complexity tier. So what does this mean for policy review? Having given that picture, what does this mean for policy review? One thing is that the economic problem that industrial policy must solve is, one, specific market failures. But secondly, it's to provide coordination failures, to solve coordination failures, which is, so because firms will not invest, because if you don't have enough power, skills, logistics, and supply linkages. So it means you have to get a lot of other conditions correctly. And some of those conditions, as some of them actually require a precursor. Only investors can make certain conditions. So for example, as you all know, 70% of Kenyan manufacturing is in 6 counties. Majority of those counties, Nairobi having 37% of that, Nairobi having 37% of that is an urban area. So for example, there are specific entrances. If you don't have a working sewer system that allows those specific public goods enough water, and also good quality water. There are specific things that in that manufacturing would always would require. The coordination failure here is that specific agencies in government, like for example, Ministry of Water and Sanitation in this case, the Ministry of Energy. So one problem could say you require to build substations or provide specific things. Those coordination failures were the things that industrial policy, even in other economies, try to solve. The second question is the learning and capability externality. I want to show, I think this is, industrial policy logic is you start from inputs, it goes to capabilities, and then it goes to scale. And then now you gain the export orientation, and then you dominate through productivity. You're able to lower those costs, and then there's structural change. So if the focus at that time is that learning and capability externalities, that firms cannot fully capture returns from productivity learning. So it means that you need to provide specific incentives to allow firms to have that learning and capability, that to build on that learning, and that will feed back from learning to go to already what firms already do directly, and then finance and other things. And then the third issue is the question of long-term finance. Manufacturing is specific. It's not like any other business. So you have we were told sometimes back that if you're having a plant, you are planning on an 8-year horizon to break even. So if most banks to be able to plan on that 8-year horizon, it means for Kenya's case, either you have to invest in that specific industry that has significant markups for a bank to give you money, or but for firms to go into, and you know what, so another thing that we learned from the economic complexity of manufacturing is that specific goods that have higher rewards also have higher risks. And those are the things that banks will not be keen to fund. That's why people made claims or arguments for an industrial bank owned by government, use that the market failure or the sensitivity of margins for manufacturing to make that argument. What a bad policy looks like.
And I don't know now that Michelle.
What a bad industrial policy looks like is it has broad and untargeted tax incentives. So like presently, there are no specific targets around the tax incentives that are provided. Import bans without capability buildups. So unless there is a capability buildup, those local content requirements, Buy Kenya, Build Kenya in this case, will not work, and that's why it will not work. That question, so for example, the EPZs, the supplier linkages between EPZs and external firms in Kenya, if you want to see that whether that kind of zoning is working, you start to see what part of value chain does those firms in EPZ form from the rest of Kenya, and that is an indicator whether that one will work. So if industrial parks exist without those domestic linkages, but they're only linked to, say, foreign. So the idea around having those parks in the first place or not. The fourth question is subsidies without performance conditions. This is any subsidy without a performance condition is rent seeking. It's actually government redistributing income in forms of subsidies to the rest to those specific players. So subsidies have to have performance conditions. Let me give an example. If you are an automotive firm, a subsidy design should be, say, for example, you are training if for every intern or specific professional you train, in government would give, say, a tax offset of, say, 30%, or of, say, a nominal figure, say 50,000 shillings. So it provides those, there has to be subsidies, have to have specific performance conditions. And then another thing is political sector selection, the selection of winners. You saw that the industrial policy 2012 predicted was predicated on 22 subsectors. Those 22 subsectors, that's government, that is political power choosing winners. But in the end, manufacturing doesn't take place, doesn't that follow that rubric. It's actually people looking at the market, innovating, and putting the plan into action. Another thing is weak monitoring and no exit rules. So if there is no mechanism to say every 3 years there's a review process, and that review process would include collecting outcomes, looking at specific questions, whether that has been achieved or not. And then that policy, industrial policy would be bad. And then specifically, there have to be exit rules. Every clause that is in it that would form part of any industrial policy, especially in Kenya, for example, there has to be an exit clause. These specific conditions are for 5 years or 10 years, and then that is it. And that allows farms to plan. Now, what a good industrial policy must do, it should satisfy the following conditions, which is narrow priorities. So the support should be on capability, not on specific inputs. So for example, if you support specific inputs, you're only supporting a specific sector. And sectoral, you want, for manufacturing, you want mass. You don't want very few. You are not interested in few sectors, because in those few sectors will exist anyway without without industrial policy support. Secondly, it has to provide industrial public goods, power, skills, standards, finance. So for example, like part of the thing of the problem with the policy, the 2012 policy say that Kenya will support standards. But then at the same time, Kenya went and supported the and required KEBS to collect that standards levy, which is an undue, while the same standards body is funded from taxpayers' money. So this aspect of revenue earmarks for specific functions and collecting specific earmarks has created. So sometimes, as Kwame correctly said, 95% of 95% of all Kenyan farms are SMEs, MSMEs. Those MSMEs, they are margin sensitive. So you take away 0.4%, whatever percentage of margins to do a standards levy that for an agency that is already funded through taxpayers' cash. That's a problem. That's a distortion. So the industrial public goods specifically there should be sensitivity around how policy is designed. So like one problem is the question of standards levy. Then another thing is that it must force performance discipline. And especially an industrial policy has to have an outward orientation, which is export driven. Even if it's export driven, once it's export driven, that now becomes a performance indicator, whether, for example, they remain as part of the program, and that will force farms to innovate. The thing is to force farms to innovate, and then export orientation also introduces another aspect, and this is you see it from China's case. Export orientation forces you to compete. And you compete on many things, including innovation, standards, quality, you innovate packaging. It forces farms to even understand foreign markets, the dynamic questions in foreign markets. It forces farms to think a lot of things about. So export orientation is important because it brings an aspect of competition, and that competition is important to ensure that there is a structural change within Kenya. And then other things like performance discipline, local content. So for example, you can say, so one aspect of buy Kenya, build Kenya, the major aspect of its failure is that it allows local farms to compete without aspect of allowing pricing discovery. So for example, if you earmark even 40% of procurement to local farms, but they have to match those prices. The same if for foreign farms would compete. So that if scenario needs to be introduced to allow local farms also gain competitiveness, because buy Kenya, build Kenya without that competitive, without those local farms being competitive, is not building that capability. And then productivity. So, and then build domestic capabilities. So a lot of things, domestic capabilities, the structure of Kenya's of manufacturing is that it's part dependent. You innovate. If you have specific segments, you see those segments. So if you look at, say, high-end manufacturing, for example, machinery, electrical equipment, motor vehicles, and then repair and installation. If you look at that high complexity part, it has remained the same over a period of time. And then a good policy has to have sunset clause. Now, the co-industrial logic is this. It starts from input, then it moves to capability. What farms can do. And that at that stage, and then it goes to scaling. Scaling now is when you already have that outward export orientation, there's capability. So if you have nanotechnology capability, you already have an export market. Then it becomes a question of scaling and then competing with other farms globally. And then that productivity. Then the question is how those costs can be lowered while maximizing that margin. So the next phase of Kenya's industrial policy has to focus on capabilities, and scales, and also that export orientation and productivity. Productivity, I want to mention one nuance. So there's a World Bank study from 2016. And what they did is that they took a sample of Kenyan farms and compared those Kenyan farms to farms in upper and middle income economies. And they came up with two broad categorizations, which is one, there are farms that are called laggards, L-A-G-G-A-R-D. And those farms, and then there are those that they call the winners. The winners are a small segment of, it was a small share of those farms that could even compete in urban middle income economies. That same farm in Kenyan farm in Taiwan would compete with peers. But the other laggards lived on government policy. That any day government policy changes, those protections were taken off. And those were the majority of the farms that were sampled. So, and that's in that sample. So in conclusion, what principles should guide policy in the ongoing review? One is there are these 4 design conditions. If you are to have an industrial policy, it has to be based on price-based instruments. It has to target costs. It has to either be reducing risk premium. So you all know what you call the adjusted rate risk of return for Kenyan manufacturing. And if it's around 14-15%, the policy should say at least say 100 basis points every 2 years. You're taking that off 100 basis points. That risk every 2 years, every year for the next 5 years. So it has to have, it should be price based. And then the second question is constraints. It should focus on information constraints. And it should not be about markets. It should not be about quantities or market shares. The second question is now rule-based implementation. Eligibility and support has to be determined by transparent rules, not administrative discretion. So if a farm, so for example, bed is benefit, there should be a clear process on how, for example, a farm ends up getting subsidies from the state, or a farm gets tax abandonment, or whatever it is, whatever form it is, or certain preferential power terms. And it should be a process where many other farms can compete to get into. So that's the rule-based implementation. The most important one is the temporal limitation. Support is explicitly temporary and with pre-announced sunset clauses. And that is important because, and that should apply not just to one specific element of subsidy benefit or whatever form of benefit that these funds would get. It has to apply to everything that is being given. That allows government two things, and also allows farms. First, for farms, it should be on the basis of predictability. You don't want to be going as a farm to meet a specific government bureaucrat saying, for example, your special economic zones license that was temporary is not up for renewal this year, and without no reason. It should be predicated. You don't meet certain conditions, you are off the list. And a farm, so that's the process of that clear delimitation. And then one thing, market test preservation, which is a farm's exit is always should be treated as an information signal, which is if farms face world prices and they exit, it is permitted and it's expected, and that is okay. And that shows that there are specific things, there are specific farms that competition necessarily in that area is not something that, whether it's it should be a capability problem, and that should allow changes, those specific changes in form policy, because at the moment, and at the moment, it's seen as bad things. Is seen as a bad thing. It should be a problem. It should be an information signal, not necessarily. It is a bad thing, yes, but it should be an information signal. Exit should be permitted and expected because that is the essence of competition. And then the welfare criterion that in thinking about these rules is if relative prices fail to converge towards competitive level after the industrial policy intervention, even if you continue to support, it lowers social surplus. You'll not be employing more people. You'll not be raising productivity. You are not raising the farm's margins. So that's the most important thing that people have to remember that about this industrial policy. Thank you so much. John, back to you for plenary.
Hello.
Yes, John.
I'm using a I'm audible.
Yes, John, you're audible.
Okay, thanks, Kemboy and Kwame for taking us through the review of the National Industrialization Policy 2012-2030. So I'm not sure whether there's an echo, but so quick summary in terms of what I picked. Yes, Kwame has taken us through what the policy entails. And the key thing to note is obviously the target of industrialization growth of 15% per annum, which was obviously expected us to push or the country towards the Vision 2030 economic growth of 10%. There are 5 targets, and the policy entails 10 pillars. And so Kemboy has actually taken us through an assessment of the targets. And I think what I picked is, of the 5, we've only achieved or met one target. That's the one in relation to setting up of special economic zones and the SME parks. And then, of course, it's concluded by giving us an implication for policy in terms of what the economic problem industrial policy must solve, as well as what a good policy entails. And there are certain principles that is taken us through, and the focus that we should have as a country in the next phase of the industrialization policy. So that's the quick summary. So now, without further ado, I would like to invite our participants. Feel free to use the icon for raise your arm. So far, I don't see any questions from the chat bot. So yes, participants, feel free to now pose your questions or make a comment. So KW, please, you can unmute yourself.
Hi.
Yes. Good morning.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, good afternoon. Yeah, and morning too. Yeah, my name is Kwamu, and my question would be, is there specific, maybe countries or specific policies that someone can go and have a look at that would be good examples of a good industrial policy? Because like the most common industrial policies that I know of is like the Kenyan examples, what Donald Trump is doing in the US, which I don't think is a good policies. But apart from like the famous South Korea thing that they were doing in the 70s, are there any other good examples of good industrial policies that someone can go and have a look at? Thanks.
Thank you, KW. So we'll have our first round, and apologies, my camera has an issue, so I'm not able to turn it on. But anyway, we'll go on. Any other question?
John, there's a question in the chat box by Paul, so maybe you could read it out as we wait for other people to raise their hands.
Oh, I don't see. Let's see. Oh yes, I've seen it. So this is from Paul Olunga. So his question is, Kenya has been accused of having amazing policies, but as they say, for ground vitu ni different. The focus on industrialization looks like a knee-jerk reaction. Case in point, the setting up of county industrial parks that were to be co-funded by the two levels of government, now stuck because the national government backs down on funding its share. And then number two, what is the space of Kenya industrial estates in this conversation? So we have those three questions, and then I guess I will allow EW, Emmanuel, to ask his question, and then turn it on to our speakers. So yeah, Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Thanks. What would the speakers think is a pragmatic, say, given that our industrial policy has largely failed, what do you see as pragmatic avenues out of where we are, and some examples of specific industrial policies that we might pursue or maybe don't pursue any at all? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Emmanuel. So, Kwame, you can go first. I hope you've all noted the questions, so you can go first, and then Leo.
Okay, fine. So well, it's dark, but it's okay. So thanks, KW. Are there specific countries whose policies we should look at, and what would be a good template? Yes, there are countries whose policies we would look at. And remember, I think the idea that industrial policy, or rather, in my view, a good industrial policy is one which expresses the ambition, but leaves open the ways to reach them. So if the ambition, for instance, is to grow at 15%, we don't know how 15% was reached, but maybe it's just a nominal value normative to suggest, to guide government or to guide investments and to provide a signal to private sector. Then government should allow that to do. But I think my view is that the specificity with which government chose 22 sectors, I mean, just basically the economy in itself tells you that government is pre-programming or choosing what sectors should exist. And that's usually a bad call. Because globally, it never works like that. And you never know, because if you knew that footwear is going to be successful, a private sector guy would have done it. So if government confines itself to how do we create the best incentives for as many farms as is possible to thrive, because remember, it's farms that are supposed to make those investments and create value out of it for markets, then that's useful. And this confines Emmanuel's and KW's question. You were both asking what should Kenya do, for instance. So if I was to revise this policy, and again, I'm not being flippant here, I'm not being facetious here, I think an industrial policy for a country like Kenya should probably be 5 pages with the goals, incentive structure that government would listed very clearly. What's the best incentive structure? The best incentive structure is a stable regulatory environment, good business conditions, good infrastructure, and low and predictable taxation. I don't think government should choose, in my view, to decide that we should produce sugarcane, or we should produce shoes, or produce any other thing. And the reason for that is that one of the things that we never know is how private sector people see opportunity. And remember, they see opportunity in how prices and factor markets work. And so that's the first thing. So when conditions are such that all, say, whether you have good power, you have good water, and all those things are available, which are actually the benchmark and the basis for industrial development, then it will happen regardless. I also think that the government of Kenya should not have place-based spatial policies, which is basically that manufacturing should be in this place. So for instance, I keep asking myself, if you're going to have an SEZ policy, which is a special economic zone policy, and say that the special economic zone is going to be in, say, Dongokundu or some part of Mombasa or some part of Nairobi or some part of Athi River or some part of Thika Road, right, where there's a special economic zone specifically established for that farm that used to print security material and printed Kenya's currency. Why shouldn't somebody decide for themselves? Why should somebody think that what are the conditions that would create a special economic zone throughout the country, so that there's no geographical bias for where industries should create, and then let local and businesses to invest based on existing conditions for competition, regardless of where it should be. And then the final point is, usually the best way to assess and the best way to ensure that an industrial policy is creating the right, industrialization policy is creating the right example, or rather creating a sustainable business model, because in the end it's businesses that must thrive, is to ask yourselves, can they export? Why? Because external markets are larger. Secondly, if you can compete globally, then you're very, very price competitive. And if you can compete globally, your markets are higher. I mean, your markets are larger. Your demand can be sustained because you have a diversity of territories to export to. And so brings me to both Japan and Taiwan and South Korea rather. And one of the successes of South Korea and all that was government actually incentivized exports. So for instance, you'd say that if farms reached a certain quantity, so you'd say that if a farm exported up to 1 billion shillings, $1 billion of goods, for instance, your tax would be reduced by, say, 1 percentage point. For every additional billion that you bring in, 1 percentage point, up to a cap, with a cap, of course, with a sunset clause and a revision here and there. What that does is it focuses farms on actually not just getting domestic subsidies, but actually exporting internationally. And when they export internationally, they're exposed to bigger markets, but at the same time to competition. That's very, very useful for productivity growth here. And so they change technologies very, very quickly, the appropriate technologies, in order to be able to keep that. That's a far greater one than simply saying, so that's an export orientation. Now, an export orientation is very different from what we have in Kenya. Kenya tends to have very strong, very, very strong import substitution codes. So that's why you hear, I'm sure many Kenyans haven't. In preparation for this, somebody asked me a question on X, rather not X, but on one of the social media, and was asking me, why are you discussing industrialization in Kenya when we are even importing simple things as toothpicks? And it shows a fundamental misunderstanding about how manufacturing competitiveness develops. Now, manufacturing competitiveness that is focused on domestic import substitution usually doesn't do too well. For the same reasons that I mentioned. One, domestic markets can be protected. External markets tend to be very, very competitive, so many firms are competing together. The competitive pressure provides innovation every single time, and you want to keep firms that can compete globally as the best firms to have in the country. If a firm insists that we can only compete because we grow sugarcane, we are important people, and sugarcane should cost double what it costs in the world market, like it does in Kenya, 3 times what it costs in the world market, only then can we run sugar companies. You know that those are enterprises that will forever remain with the feeding trough of subsidies in Kenya, or they cannot survive over time. So that's basically so it should be, the industrial policy should be an export-oriented policy. And I conclude with this. Are there countries that have import substitution? There are. And they tend to have a certain quality. One, they're large countries. So a country such as the US, the richest and the largest economy ever made in human history, 300 million people with a neighborhood of other rich countries such as Canada, can have an import substitution strategy. Why? Because its people have enormous buying power. So if it decides, as President Trump attempted, it's expensive, but it's a big country of its own, the markets are large, manufacturer producing in those places can actually export into, send goods and services across the various states. It's a very large territory, it can. China can, even though it opted for an export orientation, but it can, because if its people were poor, and that's part of the reason why it pivoted towards an export orientation, it's now coming back towards domestic consumption because its people have gained middle income status. India is attempting that with very mixed results, but regardless, big countries, big territories with big populations can. Now, if you think about Kenya, 50 million people out of a population of global population of 80 billion, of 8 billion, tells us that yes, Kenyan farms will be small, they'll have to compete, and global pressure is one of the ways to make them compete and actually to make sure that it's not just having farms, but it's also useful for consumers who buy those goods and services. So an export orientation is essential for growth, maintaining high rates of growth for a small and open economy such as Kenya's. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
And just to add to what Koma said, remember that we should not import models, and we should look at problems. What is Kenya's specific problem? And then ask ourselves, if you have specific market instruments, subsidies, incentives, whatever forms of many other tools that you can bring forward, what can we use to solve? Because you see, let me give an example to what Kwame had highlighted in the presentation. Kenya is supposed to create a 10 billion shillings fund for industrial development fund, IDF. Why? Why are they creating that? Because it's a feature in many advanced economies. You have an industrial bank, and then you just replicate it, and then a nominal number of 10 billion shillings is mentioned by somebody at that time because it was significant. Kenya's budget at that time, relative to Kenya's budget at that time, it was significant. But nobody is looking at the size of the economy and many other things. So it's not problem driven. The idea is the best industrial policy. And to come to the second question, there's a publication that was done by the Peterson International Institute of Economics on scoring 50 years of US industrial policy. You'll find they've listed many industrial policies for the US and scoring each by each. You'll see many failures and other successes. And the point is this, because it's problem driven. So like a major approach that you see in the US is they have like three main tracks for industrial policy. One is what they call industrial policy through trade measures, industrial policy through subsidies targeted to specific firms. And then they have what they call the industrial policy through public and private R&D. So it's problem driven. It's addressing very specific problems. And the failure, as Kwame has explicitly and we've shown, is the failure with Kenya's model is that it is a wish list put together. It does not speak to the main challenges of manufacturing. So like, let me give another example. The policy kicks in 2012. The pillar one is a question on what we call the business environment, a very stable macro environment. And suddenly, national treasury begins fiscal expansion. It raises interest rates, and then government starts to borrow, it crowd out. So you see, you have to be coherent. You cannot have a business environment on one side, and then on the other side, go on a fiscal expansion. So it's very incoherent because our policy is a wish list. We go, what has worked elsewhere, we put it in the document, and then we move forward. But it does not address the specific problem that is listed. Just to add on one question about Olunga's point, one thing they notice is, once they've noticed that manufacturing is concentrated, somebody says we can build 47 county industrial parks. And the belief is that manufacturing will just take place. And that is, that is somebody who doesn't understand what we call capability. Industrial policy, as you have to have capability, you have to have productivity, you have to have markets. You have to. There are specific things that actually explain why Kenya's industrialization is the way it is today. So that's the reason why people respond, and the reason why some of those responses are the way they are is because of what we call the political economy consideration. There are industrial parks that are supposed to be built. Somebody sitting in the other side will want to see those parks being built because of a specific reason, and that all of us, I don't want to restate because all of us know, because people want to build things, and that's a problem. So we need a problem driven. It has to be problem driven. We have a bad macro environment. How do we reduce the risk premium? Industrial policy has to address. So if we have to have industrial policy in the first place. So thank you. I hope, back to you, John. John.
Hello?
Yes, John, we can hear you now.
Yeah. So thanks for that. I believe Kwame and Kemboi have responded to the questions that have been posed in that first round. So we now go to the final round. Do you have any additional questions from our participants?
John, there are 2 more questions in the chat box.
In the chat, yeah. I am struggling. Okay, yeah, so I see. So Celestine, so our question is, what is I believe this must be Kenya National Chamber of Commerce. So what's their role in ensuring policy consistency across different sectors? Yeah, their role in ensuring that there's policy consistency across different sectors. So you can note that. Then I think KW has an additional question. Not able to read it.
Well, I can't. So John, maybe should I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Respond to KW's question, and then also make your final remarks. Yeah, and then Kemboi can follow. Are you there?
John, maybe I can go first, and then Kwame can.
Okay, you go.
And then
go first.
Kwame will finish. Yes. So on the KNCCI role, KNCCI is a membership-based organization, and one thing. So first, a general comment is that they can provide a basis for having this policy question to be that this problem-driven problem-driven industrial policy can be brought forward, and now that problem-driven industrial policy that address specific questions, but also is cognizant of the future that of the future where even Kenya will be say Kenya shillings 100 trillion economy. Or even 50 or 100 trillion shillings. So they can bring that space. But this is the caveat that I want to say about KNCCI. KNCCI, just like other business membership organizations and have interests, and they have specific interests. And some of those specific interests could be questions, could be saying, for example, industrial policy remains as it is today, what the players would wish. So yes. The second question, the second thing to say is about the IES YouTube channel. Our communication team is on the call, and I hope they have had that because those webinar series should be all of them should be on the because that's IES policy that at least 1 week before after the event it should be on the YouTube channel. Another thing, so in my concluding remarks, the bigger challenge with our with the industrial policy is that it has very specific requirements, and our industrial policy, those specific requirements, government chose specific sectors, the 22 subsectors. So you ask yourself, if you are not among the 22 subsectors, and policy is not speaking directly to specific questions that you're raising, what should be the direction? And that's why we are saying that it should not be input based specifically, but it should not be input based specifically, but it should be go to capability, to scaling, to productivity, to industry, to productivity, and to many and to other things. So that's why the industrial policy should be conceived. There should be some sort of a problem analysis, and then that problem analysis now shows specific questions, and then using those market-based instruments so that because the idea is you achieve structural change. It's not for firms to continue earning markups and continue operating. It's to achieve that structural change, that firms are competitive and they dominate the markets, whether local or regional markets, and also in the other space in the global markets. And then that structural change, you will never need a firm, because you always see a firm, one tech firm putting in, say, $20 billion for R&D. It's because that structural change has occurred. They will no longer require government support. But here in Kenya, it's opposite. It's farms still want to maintain that government support, so that because what they are doing is not competitive. It's not competitive. They want to continue earning those rents. So we need to move Kenyan farms away from that to that pathway that allows for graduation, so that it allows even government to support more farms, to bring on board many farms. But the principles part is important, because especially for things related to business environment, macro, what happens to budgets? What happens to if government even keeping balanced budgets is an important element of risk premium, or government keeping low deficits is important element than even many other policy things that government is trumpeting that they've done. That's a very important, because if you go to the bank and your interest rates are 5 to 800 basis points above where the market, if there was a market mechanism in place, as a manufacturer, you are hurt. You probably, even instead of having specific kind of investment in Kenya, you'll never have that kind of investment. So there's a lot of thinking that needs, a lot of economic thinking that needs to be put in place on the problem part, because majority of the things that manufacturers require really now are things that even government government support should not be put in place. I don't know if Kwame has come back. So yeah.
I'm here.
Okay, Kwame, you can go ahead.
Okay. So the two questions were, sorry, again. So the first question was, what can the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry do to ensure policy consistency? Yeah, well, I think one of the things that business member organizations such as the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry could do is to actually ask government to commit to a business environment, regulatory environment stability for at least, say, 5 years at a time. That would be extremely useful, knowing especially that manufacturing usually, the average manufacturing enterprise takes 7 years to turn around and actually break even in the best of circumstances. It means that if policy is changing materially every year like it does in Kenya, then every year it means the manufacturing firm has to do recalibration. And sometimes it's, as you can tell, that's just too much for necessarily too much on administrative burden. So that's one of the things that it could do. Commit government to the biggest policy pillars, which is basically things such as taxes, licensing, access to products. All those should be stabilized as much as is possible. It works for all businesses, not necessarily just one. It's a good macroeconomic structural, or rather, it's a good structural approach to making sure that businesses are able to thrive for the long term. So that's the first question. I think the meta question from KW is, you're right. I think we haven't edited them quickly enough, so I'll remind our office teams, including for these, to make sure that these things are available at the most within a week, because they are not just for archival purposes, but some people use them for reference, and I think it's useful. So if you're going to refer to them, people should be able to find them and to verify the content of that. So thanks for reminding us about that. Now, as I end, I think someone said here that I don't know whether Paul was re-emphasizing that trade measures, subsidies, and now for a small and open economy, a country such as this, Kenya, which has a budget deficits that have been growing, a primary surplus that is not good, and a debt that is growing at the same time, I think trying to grow an industry on the basis of subsidies is not wise, because you're going to run out of money very, very quickly. So what government then needs to ask is what Leo asked on the other side, which is basically what are the structural things that you need? What are the right price signals and incentives that are required for enterprises to thrive? And I don't think it involves government choosing that, for instance, we are going to have make shoes because we have leather. I think it's supposed to be to the best. One way that actually expands beyond one industry and one farm would require what are the best business conditions we are capable of putting in place that would ensure that businesses thrive inside manufacturing, because manufacturing tends not to thrive alone. It depends on input, some of them from agriculture sector. It depends on inputs from other manufacturing firms such as packaging, and it depends on services such as basically advertising services or other service transportation services. So manufacturing would thrive, and its absence in many cases would tell you that the average or the domestic business environment is not good enough. So fixing infrastructure requires you at the same time to fix the logistical platforms, and at the same time to provide a position for inputs to be imported, to be processed, and perhaps to be exported as well. So benchmarking with an export and to create an export orientation is essential. Now, how you do that could be filtered back down to a few principles. But the point we're making here is that a manufacturing policy doesn't have to be 140 pages or 180 pages like government programs tend to be. In my view, industrial policy or industrial and manufacturing policy, or policy fixated with creating industry in a country such as Kenya, should provide for incentives that actually enable exports. As I conclude, we just looked at this based on this question, and there are 15 million enterprises globally that manufacture, and many of them are medium-sized enterprises. So not everyone is a Boeing, and not everyone is going to be a GM, General Motors, or Toyota, or one. So those are the most ubiquitous because they also have huge advertising budgets. But most manufacturing firms are actually smaller firms, maybe 30, 40 people manufacturing very specific parts, but they feed them into other industries. So manufacturing firms, many cases, make products for other manufacturing firms so that they can have finished products. So for instance, you'd have manufacturing firms that just make boot soles or make a specific cover for your phone or something for a computer. So they're all parts and parts. And so it's an ecosystem which requires then a broader understanding. So what that means is the number of manufacturing products is so large and so vast that a country or farms within a country can find their ways to which ones are most useful and innovate into new ways. For that reason, it is not possible for a government person, however intelligent they are, and they're intelligent people in government, to predetermine what the areas of success and new manufacturing platforms would be. I don't think it's possible. So you can talk about textiles and apparel, but within textiles and apparel itself are several other countries. I mean, several other byproducts and subsectors and products. So some of them could just be textiles and they're only providing the zippers. Another part could be garments, but they're providing, say, just t-shirts and t-shirts of a different kind, or sweatshirts, for instance. So products are so highly disaggregated. And the best way for government to do is to provide a platform that enables as many firms as possible to start manufacturing and to build clusters for manufacturing success. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kwame and Kemboy. I believe they've responded to all the questions that were posed. So again, we are grateful, and I believe this has been useful in helping basically to just build your knowledge around the issue of industrialization in Kenya, but also just contributing towards this conversation. So thanks a lot, and again, thanks a lot to you as the participants for sparing time to join us this morning. As I mentioned earlier, so this is the fourth webinar, part of the Industry 254 conversation series, and we'll pick up on this hopefully next year. So look out for that. There could be 1 or 2 other webinars before we close the year. So please visit our website and our social media pages for that. Yes, on the last point by KW, yes, I believe all the presentations are on the website, but we'll make sure that the YouTube clips are posted as soon as possible. Just to finalize, IEA is a membership organization. So visit our website to check the benefits that you derive as a member. For the requirements, please check with our communication team, that's Oscar and Michelle, and they can take you through the requirements and the benefits. So thanks a lot, guys, and have yourself a good afternoon. Thank you.